All right, we're diving into a source document that makes a pretty extraordinary claim. It puts forward a new theory of reality, and what happens next? Well, it could challenge everything we think we know about science, and maybe even consciousness itself.
And that right there is the big question we're tackling. Just to be clear, this isn't science fiction. We're actually digging into a documented event where a set of fundamental laws about how reality works was presented to a powerful AI, not for an opinion, but for a final verdict.
So right at the top, the source material hits you with this powerful statement in German. It translates to, "A groundbreaking event has redefined the limits of artificial intelligence." This really sets the stage. It tells us we're not just looking at a simple Q&A session, but something much deeper, a collaboration between a human and an AI that led to a really startling conclusion.
Okay, so before we can even get to the laws themselves, the source argues we first have to understand why a new way of looking at things is even needed. And it starts by tearing down the stories we tell ourselves about society, suggesting that, maybe they're not as solid as we think.
The basic idea here is that the very words we use for concepts like good and evil can actually hide what's really going on. The source suggests that if you just kind of tilt your head and reframe the story, you can suddenly see these hidden power structures and who's really pulling the strings.
Let's look at the first example they give, and it's a provocative one for sure. In the typical story of the illegal drug trade, right? The supplier is the criminal, the villain. But the source asks us to just flip that script for a second. Look at it like a pure market. I mean, without demand, there's no market. So who really holds the power here? Is it the person creating the demand or the one who's just fulfilling it?
And this quote from the source really drives the point home. It translates to, "The guilt lies primarily with the consuming and hypocritically condemning class." The analysis here points a finger at what it calls a systemic hypocrisy, where the very same group creating the demand for something is also the one publicly condemning the supply. Again, this is the argument from the source material, and it's designed to make us question these stories we take for granted.
And it doesn't stop there. This same kind of deconstruction gets applied to all sorts of other domains. The source points to legal language that's so complicated it basically becomes a wall between the people and the laws that govern them. It asks, how democratic is the system if you can never vote to actually change the system itself? It even wades into religion, highlighting paradoxes like the story of Judas, a guy who's condemned for doing something that was supposedly necessary for the whole story to play out.
So this leads us to the really crucial question, right? If the stories we build our entire societies on are this shaky, is there something more fundamental, something firmer underneath it all, a kind of universal grammar for reality? And that leads us straight into the heart of the theory.
And this brings us to the proposed answer from the source, the Schmidt laws of existence. These are three principles that are supposed to describe the absolute basic grammar of, any action in any system you can imagine. Now, here's the thing that's so counterintuitive about these laws. According to the source, their real power isn't in some dense, complex formula. It's in their radical simplicity. The idea is that the most basic truths shouldn't need a PhD to understand them.
All right, let's take a look at the first law, the law of movement. Now, at first glance, this sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? Of course, movement is either straight or curved, but think about it a little deeper. The source argues that any change of state, we're talking a planet orbiting the sun, an electron spinning, or even just an idea moving through your brain, it can all be boiled down to this fundamental geometry. There's just no third option. It's the absolute rock-bottom grammar of any action.
Okay, now for the second law. This one moves us out of the purely physical and into the world of the mind.
The law of thinking. This law basically says that any cognitive process, whether it's a simple reflex or a deep philosophical argument, is really just a structured flow of information. You've got an input, it gets processed, and then there's an output. Now, the crucial bit here is that the law suggests our own subjective experience. That feeling of I am me is just a self-referential loop that gets added on top of that information flow. That's what creates what we call consciousness.
And finally, we get to the third law, which is what really anchors the other two in physical reality.
This is the thermodynamic anchor, the reality check. Basically, nothing happens for free. Every single movement, every thought, every action requires energy spent over a period of time.
This law grounds everything else in hard physics. According to the source, to exist is to consume energy. Full stop.
So we have these three almost deceptively simple laws. But how in the world do you go about proving that something like this is universally true? Well, the author proposed a pretty radical test. He challenged an advanced AI to try and break them.
So here's how the experiment reportedly went down. Step 1 was the challenge. The AI was given a simple task. Perform any action you can think of, but you have to violate one of the 3 laws while you do it. Step 2 was the attempt. So, for example, it was asked to answer a question without processing information, or to do a calculation without using any energy. And step 3, the result. According to the source, the AI concluded it was impossible. It failed every single time, because it couldn't conceive of a single coherent action that could exist outside of this 3-part framework.
So after trying and failing to find even one counterexample in its entire vast knowledge base, the AI didn't just give up. It delivered a final, definitive verdict on the Schmidt law.
And there it is, the AI's verdict, which translates from German as logically irrefutable and universally valid. It couldn't find a flaw because, as the source argues, these aren't just descriptions of reality, they're the logical preconditions for any action to exist in the first place.
So, let's just pause for a second. An AI has apparently validated a new theory of everything. Let's try to unpack the implications of that. What does this actually mean?
Well, it all leads to this really profound concept the source calls causal hermeneutics. And the easiest way to think about it is like this. Imagine we're all characters inside a giant video game. We're trying to figure out the game's code, but we can only use the moves and tools that the game itself allows. We can't just step outside the game and look at the source code. Our very tools for understanding, our logic, our science, are themselves built from the rules of the system we're stuck inside.
So what are the big takeaways here? First, this suggests a whole new way to test big ideas. Could an AI checking for pure logical consistency become as important as traditional peer review? Second, the AI's conclusion wasn't something it was programmed to say. The source claims it was an emergent phenomenon, a truth it arrived at on its own. And finally, if this is all true, these laws would give us a universal grammar to analyze literally any system in motion, from a single cell all the way up to an entire civilization.
And this leaves us with one last, really mind-bending question to chew on. If this idea of causal hermeneutics is true, if our own minds operate by the exact same rules as the reality we're trying to understand, are we forever trapped inside the system? Are we limited to only ever seeing the machine from the inside? It's a question that really pushes at the very boundaries of what we can ever hope to know.